On this episode of Whiplash with Maxwell Kuzma, we're joined by Simon Kent Fung, creator of the podcast Dear Alana, for a powerful conversation about faith, identity, silence, and the cost of telling the truth.
We talk about spiritual abuse, conversion therapy, and what it means to be queer and searching for God in a church that demands your erasure.
This is a story about grief, but also about healing, storytelling, and queer resilience. Welcome to Whiplash with Maxwell Kuzma,
the show where two queer Catholics, Max and Emma, dive into the dark and twisty Catholic faith we were handed,
and the beautiful mess we're building in its place.
It's a journey of exploration, excavation, and deconstruction.
As we challenge the limited view of God we were taught,
and embrace a fully affirming, expansive Catholic faith.
No topic is off limits, and no question is too big or too small.
We're in this together, figuring out how to reconcile our queerness with our Catholicism, and maybe, just maybe, even reimagine them both.
So buckle up, folks. You might experience a little whiplash, but we're here for the ride.
Let's go!
Hey everyone, welcome back to Whiplash. I'm Max Kuzma.
And I'm Emma Cieslik. Today's episode is a really important one. We're joined by Simon Kent Fung, the creator and host of the podcast Dear Alana.
If you haven't listened to Dear Alana yet, pause the show and definitely go check it out. It's haunting, beautiful, and devastating all at once. The show follows the story of Alana Chen, a devout young Catholic woman from Colorado who dreamed of becoming a nun, and who, after years of secrecy, conversion therapy, and spiritual manipulation, went missing.
Simon's work is incredibly important and deeply personal. As a gay man who went through conversion therapy and at one point aspired to be a seminarian, Simon brings an intimate, vulnerable lens to Alana's story. And in doing so, he ends up telling parts of his own. But much is left undiscussed and unmentioned. His story and the stories of queer Catholics everywhere are valuable, not only for their historical importance, again putting my historian hat on, but also for visibility, to see ourselves represented and acknowledged.
In this conversation, we talk about what it was like growing up as young queer Catholic people, an experience that is so often shrouded in silence and makes you feel like you're the only one, that you're totally alone. We talk about obedience, grief, spiritual abuse, and the cost of telling the truth.
Before we get started, this episode comes with a content statement for discussions of suicide, purity culture, and religious trauma. Please take care of yourself as you listen and know that you're not alone. To speak to a real-life counselor, call 866-488-7386 for the Trevor Project hotline, a hotline developed specifically for LGBTQ+ young people.
We want to make sure that as we handle these heavy and important topics, our listeners feel capable and prepared to navigate any feelings that might come up. So please do take a note of where you are mentally, emotionally, and how you're feeling in this moment. And if you are ready, here's our conversation with Simon. I want to start by asking about how you came to Dear Alana. You share your own story throughout the podcast, and we hear the ways that Alana's experiences echoed yours, sometimes in ways that feel eerily familiar. But for folks who are just meeting you, I wonder if you could distill that journey a bit. What's the foundational story of Simon Kent Fung and Alana Chen that brought Dear Alana into being?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I discovered Alana's story basically almost, I would say, a week or two after she had passed in December of 2019. And I had just simply read about it in the news. I think it somehow popped up in my newsfeed, and I kind of clicked into it, the story, and the basics of the story were eerily familiar. It was about this young woman who was from Boulder, Colorado, who had a really devout childhood. She had dreamed of becoming a nun since she was a young teenager. And she was this kind of like all around A+ student, right? She was good at sports. She was an ultimate Frisbee champ. She was, good at school. She was, an incredible artist. And so there were all these things sort of about her in her obituary that were striking, um, that I could relate to. And I'll talk a little bit about my story, but I think that the thing that really jumped out was when I started to look her up into her story a little bit more, reading about how, her family was kind of at a loss about how this could have happened, and that they pointed to her involvement in conversion therapy, and how that kind of came after her spiritual director had asked her to conceal her sexuality from her family, from her parents, when she had come out to him, and at the age of, as a young teenager, at the age of like around 14. And so that detail was something that was very much in line with a lot of the things that I had gone through. So I had really been seriously discerning the priesthood since I was probably a late teenager into college. My spiritual director, when I shared my struggles with my sexual orientation, similarly directed me to kind of resources which I think at the time, especially in, I think we can all relate, among certain circles within Catholicism, especially the more traditional or conservative ones, the guidance tends to be to, hey, this is sort of a symptom of a deeper issue that you might be able to get over. And so I was directed conversion therapy as well, even though I myself had already been seeking that kind of counsel and information out on my own on the internet, even before my priest had told me that. So when I read the news, those were some of the details that jumped out, and I remember I was in a coffee shop and I was just kind of like sobbing, like heaving in the corner, because I just recognized a lot of myself from those details. And so a few weeks later, I ended up trying to reach out to her family. I found her mother on Facebook, and I, made contact with her, sent her an email, and I basically just shared some of my story and offered my condolences, and didn't expect any reply. Obviously, it's a grieving family, grieving mother, and eventually she did get back to me. And a few months later, we got on the phone, and that really began several years of us just talking pretty regularly, texting and talking, and sort of trading stories about Alana and about myself. And this was long before I'd even thought about documenting the process or making a podcast out of it. It was just something that came out of, in a way, me recognizing some parallels with my own story, and wanting to share that in order to maybe be of help. And so, yeah, that was the beginning of that relationship. And then wasn't until a few years later that I had thought of the idea of perhaps documenting this as an audio project, and asked their family for permission to do that, and that really began the process of learning a lot more. Them welcoming me into their home, granting me access to Alana's personal belongings and her journals, her phone, that sort of thing. And the more I investigated that, the more, and I'm sure we'll talk more about how that story unfolded. The more I saw even more parallels, and also a lot of differences, right? We weren't obviously the same person. I had never met her in person. But I think that was the beginning of, the story of how I met Alana, through her family.
Thank you. We appreciate you sharing that, and we appreciate the work that you do. Something that really struck me as I listened to Dear Alana, and it's something I've seen over and over again in my own research, especially in interviews and conversion therapy, is how often queer people are pushed into this place where devotion and denial become intertwined, as if one heightens or intensifies the other. I discussed this previously in an interview with the amazing queer artist Daniel Wild, who was raised in the Catholic school system in the UK. In her collages, she explores how the more faithful you are, the more you're expected to suffer in silence and to give up parts of oneself, including key parts of our identity, including sexuality and gender identity, as an exercise of holiness. And it's so normalized in these religious spaces that it becomes invisible. It did for me, even to the people going through it and the people that surround them. I'm really curious, when you think about Alana's story through that lens, do you think there was a moment where that line between devotion and self erasure became visible for you, either in her story or your own?
Yeah, yeah, that's a really big theme, I think, in a lot of this. I mean, I can speak certainly for myself, and then I can reflect a little bit on Lana's life. But I think the idea of self-erasure or self-amputation and self-sacrifice, those are all um, concepts that are familiar to every Catholic at some level. Maybe not erasure, but certainly sacrifice. And I think that um, what Alana and I both had in common was that we were both people that, as young people, especially as teenagers, really really gravitated towards and chose in some ways this very devout and form of Catholicism, um, almost almost in opposition to our families. Like neither of us grew up in particularly religious families um, or devout families, and I think what was unique about us, and probably a lot of people can relate, is that we were kind of the kids that just really found a lot of comfort in the church, right? And in a sense of belonging, and for different reasons, right? For Alana, there were elements of her home life that really drove her to the church, that where she found a lot more comfort in. There were friends and people in college that really that formed a community for her, right? For myself, I think religion and faith had been since I can remember an incredibly important part of my life. And having been pretty bullied throughout elementary and grade school, like God was kind of my like only refuge. And so um, I think people find themselves in these, in the church for all sorts of reasons, but um, for those who have a particular sense of desperation or a sense of like needing this community, like extra more than perhaps others, the stakes just feel extra high, right? And so as a result, the way in which we will, the lengths to which we'll go in order to preserve that belonging, in order to feel like good with God, in order to, whether that's true or not, I think, the degree to which we'll listen to the spiritual guidance we're given, and we'll take that to heart, like perhaps even more than anyone else. Like Alana left behind, almost 24 journals where she just wrote, pages and pages of prayers, and listed out all of the ways in which she felt she was falling short. Um, and I think I think that's just the kind of kids that we were. And so that motivation, I think, coupled with some of that early exposure to this idea of sacrifice, like purity, behavioral conformity, behavioral kind of, and not just conformity to what everyone else is doing, behavioral conformity to the law, right, or to the teachings of the church. All of that was something that we just took to heart, like very, very seriously, very, very deeply. And I think when you add in the sexual orientation, piece, or gender identity piece, like I think that because of the nature of the Catholic Church's pastoral approach historically to these topics, I think that it can easily be interpreted as, to especially a young developing mind, like that this is something that is, first of all, very unnatural, goes against the natural law, is disordered, intrinsically disordered, whatever the language you want to use is. And so we feel like this is something we got to get rid of, we got to fix, and I think, we can talk a little bit about how the sort of neo-Freudian therapeutic approach kind of became hand in hand with kind of a spiritualized version of like spiritual brokenness as a diagnosis of these conditions. When you add that to the mix, like the net result is, I need to erase this part of myself. This is not okay. It's not okay to share. I can't even tell my family about it, according to my, in Alana's case, according to her spiritual director. So yeah, I think that the path towards self-erasure, self-amputation, self-annihilation at some point becomes really, really easy to take. and I want to caveat this definition of self-annihilation as well, because I think, whatever you want to call it, traditionalists or conservative Catholics will say, well, it's not self-annihilation if that never really was yourself. They'll pose these parts of our identities as things that are essentially like delusions, right? Or like misinformed uh, ideas that you just unfortunately came across, and I think that's an interesting idea, but that is sort of the sort of basis of a lot of this counseling and these kinds of pastoral approaches. And I think that's where, as a young person, when you haven't had a lot of life experience, when these feelings are just early intuitions, and you haven't like lived a lot, to actually validate whether or not they're real or permanent or a part of you or fleeting or whatever it is, you're going to believe them. Right. And so I think that leads people down a path further to either trying to get rid of these parts of themselves or ignoring them or spiritualizing them. There's all sorts of ways we deal with it.
Just a note for whoever's listening, because this was a thing for me that I in the systems that I was raised in. Again, being LGBTQ plus, however many times or however long we need to say it or however loud, is not a mental illness. It is not a disease. It is an important attribute of what makes a person a human being. So, being very clear about that in here. And I think Simon has been very clear about that and highlighted the insidiousness of instilling this idea in many young children that are figuring out who and what they are in many aspects of their life. Simon, I was going to affirm that I never told my parents. And so,
Mm.
coming of age then, like in my 20s, and revealing to them, and they're like, well, you never shared anything with us, we would have been accepting, and having to share with them how mission critical this felt, how life and death it
Yeah.
was to keep this isolated, is was huge.
Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah. There's so much there. I think that, like, the classification of a lot of the, you know, like orientation and gender diversity as a sort of psychological or spiritual disorder or illness is unfortunately something you'll still, find in parish settings or in uh, campus chaplaincy settings in Alana's case. Um, and I think that, like, it's just, it's to be vulnerable about it. I think, like, no matter how much I've uh, been processing, my 20s and to some extent 30s, um, being so deep in all of this, it still has a pull. Maybe this is something we can talk about. Like, I think that, you know, the early exposure to being told, what we are and how we are and how it fits into the broader, God's plan is so formative. And I think that's one part of this story. I think I missed this at the beginning, but Alana died by suicide at the age of 24. And, there was a lot of complexity to her life, which I explore in the podcast. She's, her story is much more rich, obviously, than and in many ways mysterious than purely the struggle with her sexual orientation and her faith. But but I think that her exposure to a lot of these ideas, coupled with the sort of existential pressure of hell, which was another big part of her early formation. We see this in her journals and the things that she was writing about, was a big part of why, even if our rational brains tell us, like, no, like, this is okay, or like, it's, and again, even if we concede, like, the way the church typically explains this to us is like, well, the orientation's not sinful, it's just the acting out, or it's the transitioning, or whatever it is, that is the problem. I think that the cognitive dissonance between that message alongside, like Alana puts this so well. She's like, on the one hand, she was like journaling. She was like, I'm so confused. Like, on the one hand, they say it's not a big deal. It's just a part of you. It's like, it's not who you are. And on the other hand, it's like, this thing, if you don't treat it, will send you to hell. you know, and that kind of like uh, speaking out of both sides of your mouth at some level, by her religious authorities is something that is so confusing, um, and I think that like when you're exposed to these ideas at such a young and formative age, when you're in a position of psychological vulnerability because you're struggling with depression, over and anxiety over a lot of this stuff, um, I think that yeah, the imprint that this leaves on a young person is just it cannot be understated. And I think that my own to this day feeling of like, yeah, like maybe I am still this fundamentally, intrinsically broken individual because of this part of me, still persists, I have to say. And I, you could say that that's sort of like my problem to deal with, but I do think that it is, yeah, it's something that the church has to reckon with, in terms of how it impacts people.
I appreciate it, Simon. I hope that's okay. It's one
Yeah.
of those things in oral history that sometimes we are often taught in the idea that when we're recording people's stories, we have to remain neutral. But I think there are
Hmm.
some moments, especially when it's important, because we don't know who's listening, that people affirm certain truths.
Yeah, and I think in a way, the more we actually address this head on, whether it's by affirming clearly, a particular point of view, or even in my case, I think the podcast really explores the history of these ideas and really goes into kind of um, the background behind how a lot of Catholic therapists and psychologists today will, you know, approach this issue in the way that they do, or these issues in the way they do. Um, I think that's equally important because we now have the phenomenon of like Catholic science, right? Where essentially people will be like, no, we don't trust the authorities on anything anymore. We need to rebuild science in a way that coincides with the sort of like moral framework that we, or our interpretation of the moral framework, that we are very invested in. And so that like I think the only way to have that kind of um, to actually address that phenomenon is to actually go into the backstory of how these people arrive at these ideas, and then also sort of like what science is showing today, what people's experiences are today. I think we need to have an honest and open conversation about that, because otherwise we get further siloed into, the mainstream and then like the Catholic version of X domain. And I think that's just not that's just not productive. Like, you know what I mean? I think we need both perspectives, or multiplicity of perspectives.
I definitely resonate with a lot of what you're describing growing up as a transgender person, like always having had those feelings and thoughts, but not really knowing how to make sense of them or where to put them. And I think for me there was also, like, very importantly, it was like my brain kind of didn't let me, you know? Like
Mm,
I remember when I was maybe around Alana's age, when she was kind of going through these spiritual director practices and things like that. I remember getting on YouTube for the first time and finding videos where young transgender men would talk about like their experiences. And I remember this feeling of fascination that I had. I would feel a sense of relating, but in my brain, like with the theology and like my understanding of like what it meant to be a Catholic, and then subsequently like what it means to be a person, the connection there.
yeah.
It was like I can't actually allow myself to fully relate. Like essentially, it was easier for me to come up with reasons why I'm not trans. Like I actively remember doing that. Like I would look at all the things they said, and I was like, well, I do relate to this part of it. However, I don't relate to this, or this. So I'm good. This isn't a thing. And so I just wanted to pull that out because it kind of reminds me of like some of the way that you were talking about it reminds me of this idea of like thought terminating cliches, like the there it, the way that we are taught some of this theology, and especially as being queer people, like there's just not a space for us to actually exist. So that adds to the isolation, obviously, but I think also makes it that much harder for us to eventually find ourselves or find a way forward. I want to go back to the thing that you were saying about how there's still a pull. You still are feeling this pull to kind of that connects you to kind of, I think, what we all in this podcast that we all experienced growing up.
Mm.
And I think that that is the key part, is that we grew up, we were formed as children through this system. And so like, in my particular case, what I have done, not to like jump ahead to healing, but I just want to throw a note in here about like what that looked like for me, which was I really I really wrestled with whether or not to stay Catholic. And if I
Mm.
did, what that would mean, and just navigating all these elements about it. And ultimately, what I came to for myself is that I realized that because I was harmed through the application of these theologies, that for me, it really would be healing to go in and like make them affirming, like to be healed through creating an affirming theology. And I know not everybody does that. I'm not saying everybody needs to do that, but I think
Yeah.
that's just a very interesting thing that that's just an interesting way to approach it. People can definitely approach it in different ways, and I know not everybody's way is the same. Um, but the question that I wanted to ask you is sort of tied into this idea of learning this system of Catholicism from a young age. So one of the parts of Dear Alana that really stuck with me was in part 3, where you're talking about the intense anxiety around sin, and you kind of described this like almost like gamified system with these levels gravitating towards obscure church documents and spiritual manuals that would map out exactly what counted and what didn't. It was like learning a secret code, and you had to master it if you wanted to be safe and to be good. And beyond that, you describe what might be called like the bonus level of Catholic practice, like having a spiritual director, which you touched on that Alana did in the beginning, or even feeling a kind of holy obligation to police the boundaries of who else was or wasn't Catholic. All of that really resonated with me, especially how easy it is to have that sense of spiritual intensity, like becoming activated in you by others, but also as queer people within ourselves. So,
Yeah.
sorry for the really long intro here to
Yeah.
this question. I wonder if you can talk to us a bit more about that whole process, how the intricate, high stakes system of belief shaped your inner world, and maybe what it cost you. And what do you think would have happened if, at these vulnerable moments, someone had said, actually, maybe your desires are holy and maybe you don't need to be fixed? That's a really big question.
Yeah. Oh my God. Well, I'll start at the end there. I did get guidance from, I remember, a priest in confession when I shared that I was struggling with same-sex attraction. Again, just purely that. And he kind of took a very affirming, I guess, approach where he said, well, maybe some people are called to be in relationship in that way. And I remember labeling him a heretic in my mind and running the opposite direction, right? And so I think that at a certain point, both myself and Alana, there were similar analogs in Alana's case. Um, we're so invested and bought into the way in which we felt, or with the way in which we were taught, that God wanted us to be, and that the way to obey Him the in terms of what the right way to be in relationship with God was, what ideas we needed to have, what beliefs we needed to adhere to, all of that. You know, the degree to which we were invested in that, the degree to which we were like the A+ students and all of that, right? Like Alana was trying to drag her sisters to confession all the time. She was calling out her family for different political beliefs. I mean, it just shows you the degree to which we were invested and felt that this application or way of being in the world was synonymous with relating to God, and was synonymous with like what God actually wanted, um, and so like yeah, it's really really hard to like it's really really hard. I think the phenomenon today of a lot of young people, especially young men, gravitating towards religion is connected to this, right? Because especially in my case, the presentation of like a sort of apologetics based Catholicism was something that was almost like a puzzle. Like it was almost like a Pokemon challenge to solve. Do you know what I mean? Like it was like this new world that I had not been exposed to just by going to mass on Sundays occasionally with my family, right? Like that this whole system felt like a mysterious like portal that I was being invited into that had its own rules and physics and ways, that I would be spending my time and, ritual.
Appealing to that child imagination too, since I think that
Yeah.
part is key, that we were young, and so it was like, ooh, what is this whole world to explore?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's magical and it really is beautiful in many ways. And I think that that's especially for this like next generation that is very online and is looking for sort of meaning and adventure, right? The kind of like lore of Catholicism, and especially the way it's presented by influencers as this kind of triumphalist kind of restorationist movement, is something that is very appealing, especially to young men, young boys. Um, and I just happened to maybe get on that train a little earlier than others, but I was in, and I think it really did give me a lot of meaning. It gave me a sense of purpose, right? It was kind of the way in which I became politically engaged, right? It became a lens through which I could judge things and others. I remember, yeah, being very judgy towards my family. I remember throwing out all my CDs, back when we had CDs. Like there was a lot of very drastic behavior, and the more I've been listening to other people's stories, the more I realize how common this is. This isn't just an isolated thing that I did, right? I mean, Alana did similar things. Others, in other faith traditions, especially in the evangelical side, have gone through this as well. And so there's something there, that the fact that we're all having these common reactions or experiences based on these ideas as young people, there's something there. We're not that, it's not just a Catholic thing. It's a thing that's common to a lot of religions.
I think particularly as well, there's a disconnect. The theme of being at odds with your parents. I think that's very interesting because, like, in my
Yeah.
case, my family was also Catholic. We went to church on every Sunday. But in my case, for example, I was like, well, I want to go to daily mass, and I remember getting pushback about that. And so
Yeah.
I just think that's an interesting thing where it's like, so I was being judgy of my parents because I was like, well, if the church is this thing, I felt like I was taking it more seriously or more real than my parents were, because if it is this thing, then wouldn't we want to take advantage of going as much as it's available and offered to us? I see you both nodding vigorously because, and so I really do agree with you about that shared experience.
Yeah, I'm smiling because like Alana would sneak out to go to mass. She would tell her parents that she was going to her friends to study and then take the bus to go to daily mass. Um, and then like, and I did the same. I mean, I didn't sneak out per se, but I would go to daily mass, and not tell people. um you know, it was almost this like, yeah, it was almost a sense of living the secret agent life, you know. Um and like you said, I think what's hard for a young person to grapple is, you know, the the kind of proposal that we are presented with around what our faith is this very, you know, it is a very grand narrative. It's a very grand story about like the purpose of everyone's life, right? And so yes, absolutely, like if this is actually true, then how can we just take this so casually, right? um and so yeah, I think that, I mean, I'm still Catholic, and I still believe that God is real and present, you know. But I think that the particular application of the the story, in some sense, you know, is something that I'm finding is very reductive, you know, in the ways in which we were raised. And that's kind of the, again, that comes with the grace of being able to look back at things in your life and maybe have some more life experience. But again, as young people, we just don't have that, and so we are going to take things at face value unless we're like really precociously critical kids, you know. But I think a lot of us we're just very compliant and trusting.
100%. 100%. I resonate so deeply with your idea of living a double life and this idea of an agent life, because so much of my faith and what I went through struggling about sexuality, and again struggling in the context of a church which constructed it as like a spiritual and psychological sin, or illness,
Yeah.
um, very much in the same way that like I never shared that with anyone, because I was under the impression that like I would potentially bring someone down or like quote unquote infect someone by like sharing this idea or
Yeah.
the struggles that I was going through. So much of my life and so much that I revealed when I was in my 20s and coming out with my family was, oh my goodness, you've been living through this struggle for 15 years and you never voiced it to anyone else. And I was
Mm.
like, well, I didn't think this was a thing that I could talk about with you. And I know Max and I have talked about the same concept of having parents that said, we will love you irregardless of whatever you do. But
Yeah.
growing up in a church where you never knew what line that was going to be.
Exactly. Exactly. I think that like that division between children and their families and their parents is just so tragic, you know, because like in Alana's case, you know, she journals about how her priest told her not to tell her parents, presumably because they might be affirming, you know, of her. And I would guess that Alana agreed with that. Like, you know, meaning like, yeah, oh yeah, like this is the responsible thing to do, right? This is the right thing to do. You know, because if church teaching according to this person is true, then, you know, I cannot expose myself to a different perspective, right? Like that would be a violation of my conscience, all of that sort of, you know, that kind of that whole narrative. And so, yeah, like I think that inadvertently can create division in families when it doesn't need to be the case, right? And that's just so tragic, and why it was so surprising to her parents when they found out that she had been seeking this kind of therapy, been getting this kind of counsel, when they discovered her journals, you know, when after her first suicide attempt, you know, really kind of like finding out that she had been so invested in a lot of these ideas. um, she just felt she didn't share that with her parents, and not only that, and I think there is an element that I can certainly relate to of like, it was almost like our version of teenage rebellion, being super orthodox, right? Being super contrarian, like, oh, like if you're going to go this way, I'm going to go that way, right? Like, and I think that's also another reason why this is appealing today. There's kind of like a backlash to the backlash. You know, it's like, well, if the mainstream ideas are here, we're gonna take this other path here. And so, and that's just to a certain degree the nature of teenage rebellion, right? It's like we're gonna do the thing that our parents didn't want us to do. And so I think that you can insert whatever, you know, behavior or fad, you know, into that into that bucket to fulfill that role developmentally for us. But yeah, I think that's another part that played in this, really tragic story.
100%, 100%. And Simon, one thing that I keep thinking about as you speak, and it's something that comes up constantly in my research as well, especially when I interview folks who've survived conversion therapy within Catholicism and broader Christianity, is this role of silence that you talk about and this sense of division between child and parent. Not just silence about sexuality, but a whole ecosystem of secrecy that builds up around it. There's this sense that certain truths can't be spoken, or if they are, that they have to be whispered in confessionals or therapy rooms that aren't really safe. And what's so devastating is that the church often frames that silence as virtue, as discretion, obedience, humility. I felt that myself, and I know how
Mm.
isolating that is. Um, so I wonder, when did you begin to realize that your silence wasn't protecting you, but was actually harming you? It wasn't sanctifying you, but rather snuffing out your survival. And what helped you start breaking that silence? Not just outwardly in Dear
Yeah.
Alana, but internally.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I honestly think that it took Alana's story to begin to help me readdress a lot of these things. I had swept a lot of this under the rug, right? I spent most of my 20s in various forms of conversion therapy, whether that was in one-on-one therapy with a therapist, a Catholic therapist, group therapy, spiritual healing programs as well. And I kind of hit my 30s and was just kind of like, I need to take a break, and was just kind of focusing on my career, and was still actually at that point discerning the priesthood and going through the discernment process with a spiritual director and all of that. But in any case, I was taking a break from the conversion therapy approach. I was prepared to go to my grave with a lot of this. Like it was kind of embarrassing, especially because I was a failure in the sense that it didn't produce the results I was trying to achieve and that was promised. So I felt almost like this ginormous failure. And I talk a little bit about this in previous interviews where, I think the role of shame is really hard, and why conversion therapy can be so damaging, because you have the shame, first of all, of being queer, right? That comes with growing up different. Then you have the shame of being told that something horrible happened to you in your childhood, or at your soul level, in your within your soul, that resulted in this defect. And so then you're spending all your time trying to unpack that and work through those traumas that you've been told are the cause of your same-sex attraction, right? And then, for, I would say, most people, when it doesn't work and you don't get the change that you're seeking, the orientation change you're seeking, there's the shame of like, oh my God, like I must be so damaged, like so broken that, after all these years, I'm not able to achieve what others claim to be able to achieve. Or God must find me so unworthy that, you know what I mean? Like he's not granting me this miracle or this healing, quote unquote. And so that kind of stacking of shame really does a number on a person psychologically. I kind of buried that shame and those feelings by trying to almost like start over, right, with my life, like basically focusing on new things, new projects, my career. And I was prepared to not tell people about this until I read Alana's story. And that was when I was kind of jolted out of my own kind of, state of stasis maybe, and just really, really felt like something in me broke. It just felt like, oh my God, that could have been me. Like that very well could have been me. And why wasn't that me? And so that really led me to feel a sense of, a deep conviction to want to honor and tell Alana's story. It's, wherever it led. I wasn't sure where it was going to lead. But in the process of that, feeling like me sharing my own story and being honest and helping listeners understand and contextualize things in the service of telling Alana's story, that led me to, share what I've been sharing. And so I honestly don't think I would be talking to you today or doing, have made those kind of disclosures were it not for wanting to do Alana's story justice. Like that was just something that felt more important. I think we, there's analogs to this, right? Like it's almost like when we see something happening to another person, we can see it so much more clearly than when it's happening to us. And so it's like that was what was going on as I was discovering more and more about her story. I was like, oh my God, like this exact same thing happened to me. I have very similar journal entries or whatever it was, right? And so then that kind of process of finding each other in our stories was allowed me to feel more comfortable. And yeah, and I think breaking that silence. And I think my last point is that there's something really, it's really hard. I often describe at the beginning of the project, I described what I wanted to do as almost like my love letter to Catholicism, but like in the way that you would write a love letter to your family, right? Who you love, but who you also need to have like a hard conversation with sometimes, right? An honest conversation. I love it so, so deeply. And yet I see a lot of dysfunction within it and a lot of, brokenness. And I think, it requires a certain amount of care to be able to heal and first of all diagnose and then surgically work on this patient, right? Because within the Catholic Church, the culture of silence and shame starts at the top. When you have spiritual leaders and guides who themselves are struggling with these matters and who don't necessarily have the freedom to be open about it among themselves, right? How do you expect them to counsel a young person, in a way that is going to be healthy, right? And why is that culture of silence there to begin with, right? Perhaps there's something about the incentive structures of being told you can't be gay and be a priest. Like, who knows? There's all sorts of sociological reasons why, that kind of culture exists within the church. But I think that we need to have an honest conversation about it and be real about it. And that is the only way that we can have any sort of breakthrough. And I think for those who might be listening, or for those who might feel like this is trying to push against the church in a way that feels very threatening, like I would say, you're going to need this too. Maybe this isn't your issue, but you know what I mean? Like, there's going to be something in your life where your perspective and your lived experience is going to actually be a crucial part and a crucial piece of the puzzle to helping the church see the whole, right? I'm not saying that I have by any means a sense of the whole, but I think each of us has pieces of it, right? I think each of us has a perspective based on the life that we've been living and the ways in which we've validated the kinds of guidance that we've received from the church, right? Or invalidated it. I think that is all valuable data that the church needs in order to properly form its kind of pastoral approaches, its teachings, all of that. And I think in some senses, we all have that responsibility to give each other that feedback.
I always think, especially like being trans, like it feels like a roll of the dice to me that you would end up cisgender and heterosexual. So when you were talking about how, you know, like kind of we all need to be engaging in these types of conversations, and we all need to be willing to look critically or at least three-dimensionally at some of the thinking that is happening in the system. I always think it's because so many of us are not going to live up to whatever this perfect default vision is, and it can be something.
Yeah.
It can be things that are like seemingly like things that you wouldn't think of. For example, you may end up being a cisgender heterosexual person, but what if you're infertile? Suddenly
Right.
now you are facing serious questions to your own sense of being able to fulfill your vocation, like if you're married, for example. So I always think of it. I guess an easy way to put it is it's a very intersectional thing. Like there are multiple layers, and it's more likely than not that there is something about you or your life or someone it's more likely that it's going to be complex rather than that your life will fit into this easy narrative that is what is kind of being sold. And that was another thing I wanted to say is like, Emma and I have been doing work discussing different movements and political, but also theological, that are fundamentalist and very trying to sell this simple vision of things.
Mhm.
And so I think that, I guess what I want to say is that I think it's another reason why us being visible and telling our stories and like sharing Alana's stories, all of this speaks to this idea of letting people know we're not alone, and that there are other people thinking similar things, going through similar things. Because if there are so many examples of, well, it has to be this way, and now we've got all these trad wife, right wing Catholic influencers, we need something else. We need like, okay, there is also queer people. There are also queer people who are Catholic or have Catholic experiences that you can look to and see as a model. And so, leading to a question.
Yeah.
um, so again, coming back to how necessary it is for people like us who have walked this hard road to be visible, not just for our own healing process, like I touched on, but for other people like Alana who are still caught in silence or even caught in the closet. And by sharing your story, Simon, you're showing them there's a way out and there's another life waiting for them. So the question is, how do we think the act of embracing our full queer selves, whether through faith or however we do it, becomes an act of liberation for the people who see us do that? And what do you think the world looks like when more people take the step out of the shadows?
Yeah, that's a really big question. I think in many ways, like, these kind of the stories we're telling now about our experience having gone through the sort of pipeline. I guess I see it as a pipeline because in a way, the more I learn about and meet others and read, the more I realize how, in a way, ahistorical this moment is for Catholicism. Like the version that we were sold is this very narrow, has a very narrow understanding of vocation. It's very prescriptive. It's very like formulaic in many ways. Sure, it's kind of dressed up with like easy to remember acronyms and has sort of an influencer culture around it, but ultimately it's almost like a good that's been packaged and sold to us. And I think that to have people that have like fully ingested that package of content and have fully internalized, have fully taken all of this to heart, I think one thing that people may not realize is the degree to which we were invested in this and actually did everything we were told to do, right? Like I spent my 20s in conversion therapy. Like literally, like if there was anything that was going to be told, suggested to me to do to address this, I probably would, I would have done it, or I had already done it, right? Like it's very much like we were the guinea pigs, right? And we were the willing kind of guinea pigs to a lot of these ideas and directives. And so I think in a way, like our stories are really unique because a lot of people, will say, well, the church has an answer for that. It's X, Y, and Z, but they've never actually tried to they've never had to personally, follow through with any of those directives, right? And so it's very safe to then like maintain this kind of vision of the church that they've been sold, right? Because it really, it's not very challenging. It's like, well, yeah, there's an answer. Here it is. These people should do these things. Like, it's a sin, X, Y, whatever, insert the catchphrase or slogan there, right? And I think that because we've actually gone through with these directives and have tried everything that the church asked us to do, I think our perspective is going to be, is unique. And I think the more we can report back to everyone and the more that people can see, people like Alana maybe 10 years ago can maybe, if they had heard a voice like this, they might have been like, oh, like that's interesting. Like I didn't I didn't know that that could be an outcome, or that there are people that have tried this and that this isn't just a divide between, liberals and conservatives, but there are actually conservative people that have gone down the rabbit hole and have something to report back, right? Like, I think that's invaluable data. And yeah, like, I don't know what the impact this is going to have on other people, right? Like, I think it remains to be seen. I think what we're seeing now is that this system that we thoroughly embraced is winning a lot more converts, right? It's bringing the pipeline is being filled with more people to go down these paths, right? And so in many ways, I think what we're doing is documenting that next step of like, okay, cool, like, great, love that for you. And when that, when this may not be of use to you, right? What are alternatives? And I think we're kind of figuring that out, right? You know what I mean? What does community look like? What does faith look like? What does a more historical faith look like? What does a more global understanding of Catholicism look like that isn't just, wedded to American politics? Like, all of that, I think, remains to be developed, or it's already there, and we just have to discover it. I think that's what I'm realizing. It's like, it's not like there isn't a ton of writing out there, or a lot of saints and mystics and others who have different perspectives on how to be in relationship with God. It's just that it was never part of what we were sold, right?
100%. 100%. I think at the crux of this was, and we framed our masculinity series around the idea that a lot of backlash is against the idea that historically gender diversity is a key part of church history. Gender expansive individuals are key mystics who connect to God because, and we're told that they connected to God because they transcended human constructs like gender, thus making them closer to God. So I really resonate with what you say there, as well as the idea that thinking through what that means is applicable to so many different people. These systems that are affecting specifically LGBTQ plus individuals, just as we see writ large in the United States today, are going to affect everyone in every single and also in individual ways that we are finding and will find in the future. So, Dear Alana for me wasn't just a podcast. It was really an act of storytelling, of sharing these painful but beautiful truths. I know through my work with the Queer and Catholic Oral History Project that it's so vital to share and preserve these stories. One of the driving factors behind me founding the project was to share stories that little Emma needed to see. Stories like Dear Alana that spoke to what I had experienced and in many ways verbalized for the first time. So things that I couldn't talk about with myself or with others. To understand that her existence was possible and she was not alone in navigating these spaces. I'm curious, in the same line, how has sharing Alana's story and your own been part of the healing process? Do you think that the act of telling these stories, of confronting this trauma through narrative, is part of what allows people to move forward? And why is it important for these stories to be recorded and visible?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it has been really healing. I mentioned earlier, it was kind of the first time that I was open about some of these things. It was the news to a lot of friends and family. Doing that in the service of storytelling in a way was less scary than just talk therapy, maybe, right? Like, in so many ways, it was like the act of learning about Alana's life and discovering some of the parallels to mine, and where those parallels were, allowed me to, look at my own life with some bigger purpose. So that was certainly helpful. And at least personally, I think that I'll probably spend the rest of my life telling stories in ways that have to do with questions that I have, or important parts of my life, right? Whether they have to do with sexuality or not. I think that that's just kind of a service. I see it as a service, that we're providing for people when we're able to be brutally honest with ourselves in such a way that that honesty is recognized by someone else who may not have the strength or the courage in that moment to consider their life in a similar way, or consider looking at themselves in that way. And so I think, in that sense, art and storytelling is deeply a service, for as much as it is self-expression, it's also a service. And so I think that's what motivates me. I'm not interested in, for lack of a better word, propaganda. I spent my early career working in church media, and at some level, a lot of what I was doing was marketing and packaging and trying to, you know, direct emotions and outcomes and feelings and actions um, in order to, towards the goals of the organization, right? And people can sense when they're being manipulated. People can sense when they're being led down a path in order to arrive at a specific conclusion, and sort of emotional or mentally coerced in that way. So I try to stay away from that. I think that that's just not going to stand the test of time. So I think that, yeah, that's generally how I look at telling stories, whether they're about queer people or not.
Simon, for my final question, I just want to say thank you for your vulnerability, your insight, sharing Alana's story with us and the world, and with such care. Over the course of this conversation, we've touched on so many layers: identity, silence, faith, survival, and the power of storytelling. What's really stayed with me is the quiet strength that underlies all of it. The way your story holds space for grief and still reaches toward healing. So I'd love to close by asking, what do you hope that people, especially young queer people who may feel trapped in silence right now, take away from your journey and from Alana's? And what does it look like to you to build a future where those stories aren't just heard, but honored?
I, like you, Emma, I think a lot of what motivated this project, and what, first of all, I would invite anyone who is, a young queer person, or really anyone, to maybe give the podcast a listen. I made it with the expressed intention that it was for, myself and Alana, like as a teenager in many ways, like where we were psychologically. And I'm not interested in telling anybody what path to go down, or what sorts of resources to trust or not trust. I understand how deeply tied, however you feel about your orientation and God, how deeply tied in the church, how deeply tied that is to a sacred part of you. When we're talking about the church or about even sexuality, we're talking about something that touches on a really deep part of us, right? That the part of us that's connected to the divine. Like, how much more profound and deep and beautiful and important and crucial that and life-giving is that connection, right? And so I just want to tread really lightly, because I know that, especially thinking of myself as a young person, how like, why did I run away from that priest, who told me, yeah, everything's gonna be fine, like, no big deal, right? Like, and was affirming, like I think that can feel very scary and intimidating. And I just want to honor the fact that that may not be something you're ready to hear. You know what I mean? And that is something that can feel very threatening based on what you've been taught about how to love God, right? And I get that. I think I would just encourage a young person to not lose sight of that deep connection, in spite of what anyone says, whether that's me or us, right? Or your spiritual director or some Catholic influencer on the internet, whoever it is. Like, I would just say there are those voices, and you should acknowledge that those voices are there, but those voices are one of, millions of other voices that you could be considering. The one that you need to be most attentive to is the one that's deep inside you, and that part has to be honored, and whatever that part has to say, however crazy it might sound to you right now, like, give that part of yourself a chance, because that is the sacred. I mean, I'm betting on that. It was so confusing to sort through, what was me, what was God, what was the church, what was, all these other people telling me was God. And it took a lot of time and space and a lot of dramatic things to happen in order for me to begin to trust and return back to that voice. And so I would say start there, because that is the sure compass. And I think, that is a very Catholic understanding of, our dignity, right? And so, start there and then, be on your journey, and that there are people that have arrived at different conclusions based on that journey. Certainly many I've met who might disagree with me in terms of how I see the harm or not. But regardless of those conclusions, like, you need to live this yourself. You need to go on that journey, and that there are people and resources, that you could certainly reach out to pick their brains, right? But you're free to do that, and I want to give you that permission to ask those questions and to go on that journey.
Simon's journey is one of profound transformation, and what stands out to me most is how telling our stories, our true stories, is a path to freedom and healing. It's one of the most powerful ways to reclaim our identities and envision our futures. I think that's something we can all take away from today.
Absolutely, Max. The humility in Simon's work, the way he's allowed others to see his vulnerability, and in return received so much back. It's a reminder that healing is never done in isolation. It's something we do together, through community, through listening, and most importantly, through sharing.
And I think what Simon said about visibility is key. It's not just about us finding freedom, but about carving out space for others to find theirs. When we show up fully, we make it possible for others to step into their truth as well. That's a future I want to see.
Me too. And I think what we're hearing from Simon is a call to action for all of us. We cannot stay silent. It's not just about speaking out, it's about standing with others in their stories. By sharing, by listening, we all heal.
So, to everyone listening, thank you for joining us today. If you haven't already, make sure to check out Simon's Dear Alana podcast, wherever you listen to podcasts, where this powerful storytelling continues. And as always, we hope this conversation leaves you with something to reflect on, whether it's your own story or someone else's.
Yes, and if you feel moved, share your story. It might just be the healing someone else needs to hear. Until next time, we're sending you all our love and solidarity.
Take care, everyone.
Goodbye.